just going to give you a brief introduction about our authors for the day. We have Hindol Sengupta is an award-winning author and senior journalist. He is the youngest writer to be nominated for the Hayek Prize and first from India. He is the youngest winner of the PSF Award, earlier won by President APJ Abdul Kalam, among others. He is editor-at-large for Fortune India. We have Makarand Paranjape, Professor of English at the Center of Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. His recent books are Cultural Politics in Modern India, Post-Colonial Prospects, Colorful Cosmopolitanism, Global Proximities, The Death and the Afterlife of Mahatma Gandhi, and Making India, Colonialism, National Culture and the Afterlife of Indian English Authority. Apart from books in criticism, Makarand has published 6 poetry collections and works of fiction. Among his latest creative writing publications are Transit Passenger. Body offering his edited books include Swami Vivekananda, a contemporary reader and healing across boundaries, biomedicine and alternative therapeutics. Last but not the least, we have Reba, an author and singer. His publications include Gandhi, Nehru and Bose, The Making of Modern India, Mind, Rabindranath Tagore, The Singer and His Song, and the forthcoming Magat Nivedita of Ramakrishna Vivekananda. She is a singer of Rabindra Sangeet and Nazrul Geeti, and her albums include her English translations of the lyrics. Please give a big round of applause to all our speakers for the day. Over to you, Hindol, to conduct the session.
It's working. Good afternoon. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. Of course, absolutely delighted also to be the youngest on this panel, and therefore it is my duty to really try and guide this panel. I am deeply humbled. Beside me are 2 real scholars. I'm only a pretend scholar. That's the honest truth. Beside me are 2 people who are really great scholars. 2 people I admire a lot, especially Makarand Paranjape. I have learned a lot from him, and many of the things that I know today comes from his writings, and I want to express my gratitude on this platform to a scholar like Makarand Paranjape for the work that he has done. I truly want to, and this is very important. I don't think we do this enough. Today we are here to talk about, and it's actually a subject much bigger than any of us.
I'm so sorry, in my excitement to introduce you all, I forgot a very important thing. There's a polling question for this session today. Did Vivekananda's work in an impactful sensitize international audiences to the concepts and theories of Hinduism? Did Vivekananda's work had an impactful sensitize international audiences to the concepts and theories of Hinduism? Right. Over to you, sir.
Because the answer is yes.
But still, sir.
That's a brilliant note to start this panel. We are going to discuss a man who's, of course, much bigger than any of us, a man whose work resonates with us even today, a man called Swami Vivekananda. He, of course, I have a very personal and intimate relationship with Vivekananda, and I mentioned in the book that I just wrote about him called The Modern Monk. And my argument, and it's a theme that we'll touch upon this afternoon, about why Vivekananda is important to us because he's so utterly, so compellingly modern. And to me, and I can only talk about myself, if he was a distant sage giving us some wisdom from antiquity, it would be interesting to me, but perhaps not as much as it is because he's so alive within us today. I want to give you a couple of examples to begin with on why Vivekananda and I have such an intimate relationship. One of the things I figured about Vivekananda was that he was a really naughty boy, you know. And my mother, who's not here, but my mother would assure that I gave her enough hell. And when I was growing up, I come from a Ramakrishna Mission family, there was enough conversation about this man who became this yogi and this monk, but who was a notoriously troublesome child. So that really covered up. But another example, which I think is really pertinent, as it so happens in many Indian families, for a long time, my parents believed that if I were to ever find a bride, I ought to find one within the Ramakrishna Mission family. It would be the best thing to do. My parents really believed that, right? Now, that never happened. And at some point, my mother became a little disillusioned that I wasn't somehow engaging enough with my spiritual heritage. Until I began writing this book, and my mother, as mothers often do, met this elderly monk of the Ramakrishna Mission from Chennai. And the monk asked my mother, how's your husband? How's your son? How are they doing? And my mother said, well, yeah, they're doing something. And he said, oh, well, is your son doing well? And my mother said, yes, my son does something. Who knows what he does, how it is with children. And then she said, oh, but I don't think he is showing enough bhakti. My mother's great thing. Somehow I feel the bhakti thing is missing. So the monk said, what is he doing these days? And my mother said, well, he says he's writing this book on Swamiji, as the Bengalis call him, Swami Vivekananda. And the monk, who's more than 80 years old, began to smile. And my mother went on, as mothers often go on, and said, my son, what's going to happen to him, God knows, and so on and so forth. At the end of it all, the monk turned to my mother and said, well, you're complaining about all these things about he doesn't show bhakti and this, that, and the other. What do you think is writing a book on Vivekananda if not bhakti? That, to my eminently loquacious mother, that shut her up. And for that moment, I believed that even today, Vivekananda is covering my back, ladies and gentlemen. He's covering my back even today. And I have an intimate relationship with this man because he's covering my back even today. But I want to go now to both of the eminent panelists with me on this platform. And I want to begin by asking Reba, on the question of modernity, where we began, ma'am. You're writing, of course, this wonderful new book on Sister Nivedita. And Vivekananda's moment of modernity and what he represents to us today, even though he, of course, was a citizen of British-ruled India, how do you see his modern influence today and what he means to us today?
Well, first of all, Hindol, I must say I enjoyed your book very much.
Thank you very much.
And I can start with that a bit, because Hindol writes in his book that Vivekananda was really cool. Now, this is a term that, immediately the younger generation can relate to. And I think that, for me, is also a key to this modernity that we are talking about. Because Vivekananda, and then you write somewhere else, I think I did, yes, that he pitched right to his audiences. That requires tremendous intelligence, because Vivekananda's whole life came about in a way that he himself had not dreamt of. After Ramakrishna died in 1885, he went on his Parivrajak days, when he went as a monk with nothing but a bowl, and he traveled all over India on foot and on various ways, practicing austerity, etc., etc. How he eventually managed to go to Chicago is another story. I mean, that he had never dreamt of. Because he addressed the poor people, he addressed the princes of India, he was told about this conference, and he was asked to go. A courtesy, all the support he got from the various admirers and princes, Khetri being the main. And he finally fetches up at Chicago, only to find he's come weeks, even months ahead of the schedule, without even an introductory letter. And then how chance takes him to Boston and various other places, meets the Harvard professor, and finally gets a letter of introduction to go to Chicago, to come there to find he's misplaced that letter. So he has nowhere to go. I mean, it's really quite a bizarre story. And finally, that one night he spends at Chicago railway station in the yard. And the next day he's frustrated. He knows that he's not going to go very far. In his monk's robes, children are following him, wondering what kind of a freak he is. Then he's sitting there on Lakeshore Drive when the door opens of one of these grand houses, and out comes this lady and says that, "Are you going to the Parliament of Religions?" And he says, "Yes, I'm trying to." Then she and her husband take him in. And then, of course, the rest is history, his famous Chicago address and Sisters and Brothers of America and so on and so forth, we know. So the point is that once he was there and he realized that he had a mission to do, he pitched right to his American audiences. He spoke about in a language that they would understand. There was never any mention to his guru, Sri Ramakrishna, as an avatar. There was never any mention to ritual religion, to the various Hindu pantheon, which they wouldn't understand. He spoke about divinity within, the God within, and the need to realize yourself in very basic terms. When he came back to India, it was a different Vivekananda. And this is where the modernity comes. And I think you have to be an intelligent person to know what to speak to. But they're not contradictory, mind you. Because in England, he meets Margaret Noble, who later becomes Nivedita, who sees this aspect of him. The aspect of Swamiji when he was abroad speaking to Western audiences in general terms about divinity within and so on. Margaret Noble comes to India following him and makes India her home. And when she comes to India, she gets a shock of her life because she finds Swamiji saying things that she was not prepared for. And what was he saying? He was speaking to the Indian audiences. He was actually performing puja. And she sees Kali. She's shocked with Kali. She finds this a bizarre statue with all the heads, and she writes about it. So I think modernity means when you are able to address different audiences and finally explain to them at their time, at their pace, because after that she became Nivedita and one of his closest disciples. I think modernity for me, at the way I see Vivekananda, and what makes him relevant to this day, is that his message rings true even now, because he was able to pitch right, as he said it.
No, absolutely. I mean, there's this one point where, which really intrigued me and fascinated me in the book, where he's writing this letter, Vivekananda's writing this letter from America, that one of his benefactors who's helped him, this lady, they travel in a carriage every evening around a park. And he, of course, is this monk with his rich, saffron robe. And a lot of people with his turban and his clothes think he's a prince, quote unquote, right? And they're intrigued by the fact that, here's this exotic Indian prince. And of course, Vivekananda, being the intellectual that he is, realizes what's happening, realizes that these people are being drawn for perhaps the wrong reason. But at the same time, simultaneously, it's almost what we would today call in marketing parlance, he knows that's the hook. He knows that is the hook through which, even if some people are drawn to him, the message can only percolate if there is a hook. And he understands that perhaps his clothes are a hook. He understands that, there's this whole thing about how well he speaks English, perhaps better than many Americans of that time, right? He speaks English beautifully. And he understands that if he did not speak English that well, perhaps his ideas would not immediately reach out to these people. He gets these hooks. But he is able to accommodate all of this in his worldview because he sees the bigger picture, so to speak. He sees that there's a bigger thing that he has to do. And all those hooks are just as they would say, just things that he would use. But I want to turn to Makarand now. Makarand, of course, has written extensively about Vivekananda, is writing another book about Vivekananda and modernism in Hinduism, which I think is going to be really, really fascinating. I want to turn to you. You have written extensively, not just about Vivekananda, but about this idea of what he meant to bringing about this idea that Hinduism could be modern. And that is a unique moment, perhaps, because here is a man, and Vivekananda is cognizant of that. He knows that he's part of this colonial nation and this, that, and the other. He's able to rise above it all and talk about an entirely different vision, so to speak. How is he able to do that? And why does he work? Why does it work?
Well, I think a one-line answer would be that he was able to repackage a very old tradition and present it in a form which was rational. And I think when you ask about modernity, then its defining feature is the regime of rationality. And of course, to India, when we look at modernity, it comes to us through colonialism. And what colonialism does is it distorts the Enlightenment, the liberalism, and the rights of man, and all of these ideas that have come after the French Revolution and the Industrial Revolution and all of that. And it distorts it in such a way as to justify the superiority of the colonial regime over the native Indians. And so, in a sense, what Vivekananda does is he upends this whole hierarchy by saying, you know what, actually, what the ancient people in India had is quite unique and very different from how you've portrayed it. So I think that it's that transformation that he's able to bring about, which makes him so unique. So it's like reclaiming and repackaging Hinduism. And of course, there was a lot of this going on through the social reform movement. Prior to him, Dayanand Saraswati was doing something. And there's also a whole modern dimension to the Gaudiya Vaishnav Parampara, of which today an offshoot is ISKCON. And then the Swaminarayans, who are now famous for building huge temples. You see, this was happening around the same time, the late 18th century, and then through the 19th century. But somehow Vivekananda was the trigger, because he was the first Indian to go to the West and reverse this colonial trend. And in doing so, he raised the self-respect and the confidence of a defeated people. And you know, these great acharyas in India, whether it's Guru Gobind Singh or prior to that Shankaracharya, you know, they always have this Digvijay Yatra, this great victory that they go crisscrossing across the continent. And Vivekananda did that. He came to Sri Lanka, and from Colombo, where people used to pull his carriage and the streets were strewn with flowers to welcome him, he crosses over from the straits of Mannar and from Pamban, that's the Rameshwaram, and enters the Indian mainland through Tamil Nadu. In fact, it is in Tamil Nadu, in Chennai, that his great impact on the youth is first felt. You know, Alasinga Perumal, and whereas the Bengalis are very jealous of him and quite skeptical, you know. But there is that great victory march of his from Colombo to Almora in the end. That's in fact a volume in the collected works of Swamiji. There are these lectures he delivers from Colombo to Almora. So that's his great Digvijay Yatra, where his victorious march through India, where he rouses this moribund nation, you know. It's like a Shaktipat, you know, like an awakening mantra. And I think that this electrifying sort of, you might say, revitalization of an entire supine subcontinent is his great achievement.
You know, one of the things that occurred to me when I was writing The Modern Monk is how, in a sense, how stark often Vivekananda's language is. It's not a language of a monk, if you know what I mean, right? Or at least what we think of as the language of a monk. He isn't skirting issues. He is not, you know, delicately putting things. I mean, in the last book that I wrote called Being Hindu, one of the things that occurred to me, and I think you and I even discussed this, where there's a letter where somebody has written to him asking about the miracles of Ramakrishna Paramhans, his spiritual guru. And obviously an exasperated Vivekananda is writing back saying what nonsense about the miracles of Ramakrishna, as if he had nothing better to do than convert Gupta's medicines into wine. You know, he's so exasperated with this idea, and he's like, you know, you don't get my spiritual master, you don't get what we are talking about, and you want all these silly crutches which we are not interested in.
Precisely, Hindol. In a way, you know, we are a very pietistic people in India. Devotion comes very easily to us. And to pedestalize somebody, you know, and then uski puja karte raho, you know. And we are always looking for these idols, you know. We can put them up there, and then we continue to lead our own wretched and hypocritical lives, you know. In a way, Vivekananda was very resistant to that pedestalizing, even of his own master, Ramakrishna. And he was exasperated because he said, Acha, you started worshipping the old man even here. So when he went to Mayavati in the Himalayas, he had all the pictures and the statues removed, and there's only an Om there. But, you know, the real point is this, that when he establishes the Ramakrishna mission, that's on the 1st of May, 1897, okay? So he's already come back, he's gone to the West twice, and raised money, and he's a very well thought of and sought after speaker. He makes money as a speaker in America, which shows a kind of new Indo-Western partnership. Today we tend to be very anti-Western, which I don't think was what Vivekananda stood for. He stood for for a new cosmopolitanism where the so-called Hindu was at home in the world. Anyhow, so when he establishes the Ramakrishna mission on the 1st of May Day, right? His brother disciple of Ramakrishna, Swami Yogananda, says, but he takes him aside and he says, this is not what our master taught us to do. Because, and this is very important because he's not even following, to all appearances, Ramakrishna's way. Because Ramakrishna used to say, bone, kone, ekane, retreat and, realize yourself. Your work is to find God. And, but Swamiji turns that around and comes up with this idea of practical Vedanta. And what is that? And so he starts this mission. Think about the word mission. It's a very Christian idea. And then he says Ramakrishna mission, right? So Yogananda says, this is not what our master asked us to do. What are you doing? And he says, how dare you limit the infinitude of Ramakrishna? So this is an idea of, realizing yourself, knowing who you are, is actually two kinds of freedom. Freedom from something, freedom from suffering, let's say, freedom from incapacity, freedom from limitation. But it is also freedom too. So what he says is, how dare you limit Ramakrishna to some pietistic and quietistic cult where you retreat from the world, go into a corner and do some jap and bhajan. So he says, you have to become aggressive in your efforts to take spirituality to the people. And you can't talk spirituality to a man or a woman who's hungry. So he said it's better to play football than to read the Bhagavad Gita. So basically what Vivekananda did was to say that Indians disguise tamas, sloth, inertia, incapacity, cowardice, under the garb of sattva. Sattva, which means, light and clarity, transparency, the self-knowledge that comes from all that. And he says, we are very tamasic. So instead, be rajasic, be active, act on the world, try to change the world. But so concentration, yoga is the key to success. And he's a youth icon precisely because of that. Though there's a joke going around that when they decided to make his birthday the National Youth Day, somebody in the committee, this was in Indira Gandhi's time in 1984, said, why we should choose Vivekananda? Because of all great Indians, he's the only one of whom there is no portrait when he was old. So he was only a young man because he died before he reached the age of 40. But he's a youth icon precisely because he preaches the gospel of practical Vedanta, which is to be active in the world and to help everybody. He says you can find God only by helping others because God resides in everyone. And it is that idea of non-dualism which is in a way very modern. And in that sense, as Hindol himself said in his book, he was to an extent disobeying his own master, was he not?
I really like this disobeying part of it because I think I've been fascinated. And I'm going to turn to Reba Shom in just a minute. But this anecdote about in Indira Gandhi's time and why it became National Youth Day, I also think he's cool because he did that ultimate cool thing which only some rock stars can do, which is die young. You have to die young. If you really want to be cool, you have to die young. You can't hold on and go on and on for years and years. By the time people get bored of you. So he was a cool guy because he came in, he said what he had to say, and he exited. He really had the talent to exit at the right time. But I'm, of course, joking about this, but I really think that is a cool part. The other thing, and I think we should discuss that part also, which is his relationship with science. Because he's a man at that time saying, and that's one of the most powerful things, that he's asked a question that, does religion have anything to do with science? And he says, not only does it have something to do with science, if a religion cannot follow the parameters of scientific inquiry or cannot hold to scientific inquiry, reject that religion. It has no basis. It should not survive at all. So I want to bring you in on that point. How was he able to do that?
Before we go into that, there's something that struck me when the two of you were talking.
Right.
You see, Vivekananda was also a very angry young man.
Yes. Yeah.
Now, imagine when he comes back to India, he who had his guru in Sri Ramakrishna, he who had seen Kali as a mother, he had really felt her presence, which had transformed him, something that he writes about in his personal accounts. Whether you have seen God. And the story goes that this is what had brought him to Ramakrishna, asking him, have you seen God? And Ramakrishna had said, I see him as clearly as I see you. And, this famous story. But later on, when he went through a lot of pecuniary distress, Vivekananda, he had come to Ramakrishna saying that I'm in real bad times because of legal suits, etc. He was in a bad financial position. So the story goes, and this is what was recounted to Nivedita, that Ramakrishna said that you go ask Kali, go to the room, go to the deity and ask her for help. She'll give it to you. And he says that when he went in there and he looked at the eyes of this idol, he sensed that she was alive. And he couldn't speak a word. He was mesmerized. And he came out. And Ramakrishna said, did you ask her? So he said, no. He said, go back. 3 times he went. And he sat in front of the statue, the idol of Kali, and just felt that that was real. Now, with this devotion behind him, Vivekananda comes back to India and goes to Dakshineshwar with the Raja of Khetri who had supported his going to Chicago. And he wants to show this wonderful place to the Raja of Khetri, his great benefactor. And he realizes that they are reluctant to let him enter that temple. That hurt him like nothing else would, because he had crossed the oceans and hadn't done a ritual purification. Which is why the family of Rani Rashmani, who were in charge of that temple, were very reluctant, and they even did an abhisheka, that is a cleansing, purification of the temple after he had left. Vivekananda never went back to Dakshineshwar. His whole focus was in Belur, which was on the other side of the Ganga. Now, he, being the angry young man and an intelligent man, he had to get even. Now, when Nivedita comes to India and sees Kali and doesn't understand this fierce-looking Kali, he goes through great extent to explain to her the whole idea of beauty and the whole idea of destruction and death, life and death being 2 sides of the same coin, beautifully expounded to her, which makes Nivedita write Kali the mother. He then tells her that you as a foreigner, as an Irish-Scottish lady, you will give 2 public discourses on Kali. And where? She has one public speech where she publicly speaks on Kali, and all the people of Calcutta are there to hear her. And then, you won't believe this, Kalighat temple, the priests of Kalighat temple ask her to come to Kalighat and give a similar speech. So there she is speaking, and who are the people listening? Many of the Brahmo Samaj, many of the Tagore family, who were Brahmos, who didn't believe in Kali at all. So this was something that Vivekananda didn't go that day when she gave the speech. But in the morning he went, because Sharoda Ma had asked him to go and instruct Nivedita as to how to conduct this speech. But he kept himself out of it. So this was great intelligence, and again the modern bit in him, because he had his last laugh, because she spoke on Kali the mother, and there were many people who didn't like it, but they had to hear her all the same. Sorry for the digression.
No, I just want to make one point here, and this is another thing why I think he's cool. He really got before anybody else that if you go to the West, especially if you go to America, and come back and tell Indians something, they will get it. Exactly. From Vivekananda, the Bengalis knew this, from Vivekananda to Satyajit Ray. Satyajit Ray also explained, my father tells this great story, that when Pather Pachali first released in Kolkata, nobody went to see it. Nobody. Bengalis thought, what is it, rubbish? Show some whatever village and whatever. The moment the West lapped up Pather Pachali and said he's this great author and whatever, all the Bengalis immediately went to see it. So you see, we have a great tradition from Vivekananda to Satyajit Ray. Once the West tells us this is good, immediately we follow. And Vivekananda got it. That's why I think he's really cool.
Well, just to add a footnote to that, he very cleverly used the United States against England and almost anticipated how it would become the great empire and how Britain would be eclipsed. Because in England, nobody would have paid attention to him. He came from a colonized part of the world. But in America, which was so much more open, and it was the ladies who supported him throughout, and they had so much freedom. So when he came back, he became a great champion of the rights of women in India. Rights of women, the rights of depressed castes. So there was a huge social force to Vivekananda's mission, which also makes him modern. But to come back to your question, Hindol, two things. Again, what makes him cool? You know, this sartorial elegance and the hook that you talk about. See, he was a designer, he made up that dress. In fact, he experimented with many different kinds of turbans, and he got himself photographed in various studios so that his publicity pictures could be circulated, and that could help market him as a speaker. So, you know, those robes, the turban, this was a part of his sartorial, not so much elegance as experimentation, and a part of the marketing of Vivekananda. And so that's one of the things that makes him cool, the whole idea of how to market an idea and how to promote it. And yet, what makes him totally unlike, you know, the marketing successes and celebrities of our time is that they're only marketing. There's nothing, there's no substance. But he was a very hard taskmaster. He taught all the 4 yogas in the United States, you know, Raj Yoga, Bhakti Yoga, Karma Yoga, and Jnana Yoga. And he was the first in modern times, before Aurobindo, to synthesize the yogas and try and portray Hinduism as a rational system, you know, of knowledge and realization, which is what brings us back to the question of science.
Yes.
See, because he says that what is science? Science is the study of the world as we know it, the world of matter, the external reality of nature, through a particular methodology, which is the methodology of experiment, empiricism, which produces accumulative but verifiable and predictable knowledge. And he says, you know what, religion is also similar. Religion is not based on authority or dogma, but it's based on experience. It has to be proved in the laboratory of the spirit or of the soul, as it were. So he was a pioneer not only in the interfaith dialogues, which started in the Parliament of Religions itself,
Intra-faith dialogue.
interfaith, but also the dialogue between science and religion. You see, because that's what I call the double helix, where he said that actually science is also a form of religion, because it's also based partly, you know, on dogma. People just follow things blindly because they say science has proven it. So he said you must question scientific dogma as well as religious dogma. And you know, one of the great sort of after effects of this whole movement of Swami Vivekananda to America is hundreds of other gurus and yogis have gone there after him, in his wake, in his footsteps, so much so that there's a book called The American Veda, which makes the point, by Phil Goldberg, which makes the point that the religion of the Americans at the Parliament of Religions, 1893, was dominated by exclusivism, and the inclusivists were a smaller group. But the pluralists were almost not there. But today, there's so much more pluralism in the United States. But one more point about science and religion. You see, it was Vivekananda who suggested that matter and energy are related because they all come from the same source. So there is this argument that he anticipates modern physics.
Yeah.
And, you know, he wrote about this in a letter to Sturdy, T.E. Sturdy. And he also, you know, Tesla came to one of his talks.
Tesla, yes.
Exactly, and he talks about how manifestation is Mahat, Akash and Pran, and one Pran leads to energy and Akash leads to form and matter. So he was trying to synthesize all this. Of course, that didn't quite happen. And there's one more very important thing. On his trip to the United States in the ship, There was another very important Indian who was traveling westward, and that
Jamshedji
was Jamshedji Tata.
So the only reason we have the Indian Institute of Science
Not
is because
the only reason.
I mean, one of the
Actually,
big reasons,
Jamshedji wanted that institute,
But
of course,
the inspiration
the Ramakrishna
was, yeah.
people want to take credit for everything, which is also, but because it's their guru and their icon. But if you really look at the documents, there
And the
was
letter
the
that was-
letter,
the
there
letter
this
that was-
synergy.
yeah.
And the first editorial he wrote, Ghost wrote for Prabuddha Bharata, was to encourage the scientific spirit in India, which is the spirit of inquiry. So I think that in that sense, he was a great pioneer.
Another thing which intrigued me when I was doing research for the book is his engagement with Darwinian ideas. I mean, he's really engaging with Darwinian ideas at a time when many in the West, and maybe an overwhelming number of scholars in the West, actually disagree or are still trying to understand Darwinian ideas. And his almost easy acceptance or accommodation, should I say, of Darwinian ideas is something really novel, coming from the fact that he comes from India, this great ritualistic tradition and so on and so forth. But he seems to use a common parlance, get Darwin, when many in the West also they don't know what to make of Charles Darwin and his ideas. He gets Darwin and he says, yeah, well, this makes sense, right? I was wondering if you could sort of,
No, this is very true. But again, I'll come back to Nivedita, on whom I've been working, because she was in many ways his spokesperson. Vivekananda wanted someone to lucidly put into good lucid prose his teachings, and she does that admirably. And the master as I saw him, or the Web of Indian Life, they are absolute classics. If you want to know Swami Vivekananda, you have to read Nivedita. But coming back to religion and science, one of the reasons she followed the lead of Swamiji when he said that there was this great connect between science and religion, Nivedita actually followed and supported and patronized the famous scientist Jagadish Chandra Bose. And many of the manuscripts of Jagadish Chandra Bose she edited. She was with him even till her last moments. And this whole concept of Jagadish Chandra Bose was that because he had an interdisciplinary background where he found that electrical impulses created similar stimuli in organic as well as inorganic substances. And that made her conclude in the Vedantic doctrine that universal oneness embraced all living and non-living matter. This was something quite significant. And may I read out? Yeah, there's something that I came across in the letters of Nivedita, which I found fascinating. Jagadish Chandra Bose is doing this experiment in London, and the local newspapers are reporting on this. And it says, "Can metals feel?" This is the caption in a London newspaper. "Last night at the Royal Institution, Professor Jagadish Chandra Bose proved that they can, in much the same way as animate beings. He struck a piece of copper, pinched a piece of zinc, gave it poison, and administered antidote, and threw light upon an artificial retina. In each case, the electrical emotion, as registered by the galvanometer, was painful to witness." Then it says, "There is an opening for a society for the prevention of cruelty to metals."
One of the things why I wrote the Modern Monk, and why also the Modern Monk, the cover of the Modern Monk, when I first started writing books on Hinduism, many people told me that the cover of all books on Hinduism has to be orange. So therefore, I quickly went over and published with Penguin because their logo is orange, so I thought it would match up nicely, right? But then we figured that we don't need to do that. And one of the reasons this is what the cover looks like rather than orange, is because I was exasperated, and I want to put this to both of you, about this thing that Makarand mentioned about putting people on a pedestal and taking away all human attributes from that person. You put them, and Vivekananda, we've made him into our own little Che Guevara, right? He pops up on a t-shirt and a mug, and he's always there, and because he's such a fascinating person, he has got those luminous eyes, his arms are always folded, he's looking down on us, he's challenging us, but he's become, We paste him everywhere, right? Wherever we, and this arise, awake. I often think that in a country as somnolent as India, how many times will we be told to be arise and awake? And Bengal, Bengal, Vivekananda has been telling Bengal, arise and awake for God knows how many years, but Bengal is still not arisen and awoken. Bengal is still sleeping. But anyway, so, my larger point is that the caricaturization of Vivekananda, the easy caricaturization of Vivekananda, almost two-dimensional, bringing Vivekananda down to a two-dimensional figure, so to speak. Why has that happened, and how can we reinvigorate through your work, and to a degree my work, the real essence of the man that Vivekananda was? Not so, the monk of course, but the real enriching, captivating, mesmerizing human, a man. And I'm fascinated by him because he gets angry, right? He falls ill, right? He often, when he's angry, in his letter, almost shouts at somebody, if you know what I mean. Loses his temper, writes these angry letters, is constantly troubled about familial relations, right? Court cases. That letter he writes at nearly the end of his life, asking the Raja of Khetri for money, saying that, I've given up everything, but this is still an albatross around my neck, right? He's so utterly human. We've all felt those emotions: family burden, anger, irritation, illness. Why has that human being gone lost to us?
No, in fact, it's that humanness which makes him so relevant. He says somewhere to Nivedita, and again I quote from a letter, he says, I eat hugely. He was a great cook. He loved food. He loved
a new recipe of khichdi.
Khichdi, yes. And yes, that famous story when he comes back from a lecture, a very spiritual and very serious lecture in the United States, and he's coming with his Josephine McLeod, his disciple, and he's pondering over something, and then finally Josephine says, what is it you're thinking of? He says, oh, now I get it. So she thought it was some spiritual revelation. He says, now I know they put bay leaf in the malagatoni soup. So he's writing to Nivedita, I eat hugely. I can go without food altogether. I smoke quantities. I don't smoke at all. As much power as I have in the control of the senses, I have also in the senses themselves. Else, what would control be worth? That sums up Vivekananda.
A monk who smoked, which I think is really cool. But I want to, take that question to you. Sure. The caricaturization of Vivekananda and how we could rescue him from it.
Well, we can't rescue him, really. In fact, I always say when we come across these larger-than-life figures, is don't do as they say, do as they do, which is very hard. You have to, in that sense, become Vivekananda-like. And that's the point. In fact, in England, he was traveling with a very famous professor, and he said, what kind of a monk are you? You smoke, you drink, you eat meat. He drank also. That is not mentioned here. But, so what kind of a monk are you? And he became very serious, and he says, I keep the two vows that I took, which is poverty and chastity. So, I think that you prevent him from being a caricature by actually trying to put some practice into your life, into our lives. And I think this is where Vivekananda is as traditional as he's modern. Because modernity is based on a split between fact and value. It's based on a split between personal and public. But the entire basis of Vedanta is that it is only your sadhana, your practice, that can make you who you are. So you have to embody a higher consciousness. It's not enough to talk about it. And this is where I think the entire modern system of education fails, because it detaches us completely and only trains our intellectual faculties. Then he spent a lot of time thinking about education. And he says education should build character, should build men and women who can also sacrifice for a higher cause. It's not just indulgence. So I think what makes him human, and you're right, his letters are, by the way, completely bowdlerized and edited. Nobody wants to the Ramakrishna Mission has a tight control over the manuscripts because he abuses everybody in the letters. And some of this abuse is despite the editing. You know, when I did a book on him, a reader on him, I had some of his letters. And in a couple of letters, there are these ellipses indicating where the well-meaning Swamijis of the mission edited the letters. And then, but they were also very innocent about it. So there's a part where, you know, in brackets, he says, please don't publish this. And they publish right that thing. So, you know, we censor these people. We want to control their legacy. We're afraid. And that happened with all the people that who were so-called great in India. But I'm only saying that what Vedanta, what Vivekananda, what all of these people tell us is that to be human doesn't negate being divine. So I think Reba put it very well, that only a person who has a certain degree of austerity can actually enjoy the life of the senses. This morning we had a whole panel on rasa. And that's where I think we should talk about the limits of Vivekananda as well. Because I think he was still quite a prude, you know, and he had a big problem with sexuality. He wasn't quite able to fully negotiate that. And that comes across partly in his relationship with Nivedita, who was very much in love with him. It was a kind of romantic relationship. But whereas his master, Ramakrishna, with his own tantric sadhana, had a much easier relationship with his own sexuality. And in that sense, Vivekananda was much more of a Victorian, much more afraid, you know, of that dimension. And he would always see when there was a dancing girl in one of the Rajputana kingdoms, he just walked away from her. And then she says, Mere avaguna chittana dharo, the Surdas, and he came back. So there were all these instances in his life. So I think to answer your question about how not to caricaturize some of these great figures is we should also study them at their limits, not just study them at their heights, and see where they stop short. You know, what are the lacunae there, you know? And I think that some of this kind of critical questioning leads us into a hermeneutics, which is neither, you see, that's the point. Now, you look at what's happening with these figures. On the one hand, you've got a whole, you might even call it sampradaya, a whole tradition of studying these figures from within the Ramakrishna mission and the disciples for whom they're divine figures, okay? So it's completely hagiographical. And on the other hand, you have the secular tradition of scholarship, which is totally irreverent. It has no actually sensitivity to the...
But often inaccurate also, not just irreverent.
Sometimes inaccurate, but sometimes they're good scholars.
And sometimes malicious. I mean,
sometimes they're completely malicious.
Yeah.
So what I'm trying to say is that we have to find a middle course to retain our critical abilities and to be very clear about facts and historicity, and yet not negate religious experience. Because remember what William James did, varieties of religious experience, to see religious experience as a valid epistemic category. It's not just some mumbo-jumbo, but it actually is a form of cognition and of understanding the world.
I think we have a few minutes left, so we should take a few questions to end this panel with. So please feel free, raise your hands, let the microphone come to you. And yes, sir, we'll just come to you. I think the microphone has gone, you came ahead, the microphone has gone behind you. But and just my only request is, please do ask a question. I'm sure you may have a point of view, but we don't have enough time. So if you ask short, pointed questions, it'll enable all of us to answer quickly, and so that more people will have a chance, yeah? Yes, sir. Could you give the gentleman the microphone? Yes. Go ahead, sir.
Myself is Umesh Prasad Singh. I'm an ex-student of Ramakrishna Mission, Narendrapur College, and I'm happy. The question with respect to Swamiji is this, that education, according to Swamiji's manifestation of the perfection which is already in man, until and unless there is a perfection of manifestation. Now, in the present system, the evolution, as you mentioned, Swamiji speaks about involution also. Involution and evolution. The growth is not just horizontal, but vertical. So in this point, I would like to know from you, as you have studied a lot, that in what angularity of vision the humanism needs to be trained in the light of Swamiji in specific
I think
sense of
Makarandji
the
wants to
term.
answer your
You
question.
see, all my life I've been in this field of education, and I think there's a lot of confusion in the sense that we always think we should do something to other people. But you see, we have to first do something to ourselves. There is that inner engineering that is required. Where is the perfection within us before we start, making other people perfect? So, and as teachers, parents, खोट तो हम लोगों में है. But you see, the point I'm trying to make, coming back to Swamiji, is that, there is a threefold process of trying to do something in this world. There's consecration, then there's design, and then there's execution. So to speak, perfection, within quotation marks, within scare quotes, must manifest at all these levels. But we fail even at the first. There's no consecration. When there's no consecration, then where will there be design and where will there be execution? There'll only be flaws throughout because our motives are not right. So consecration is not there, there's only selfishness. So the first thing we have to do is to try and understand a higher life, a higher reality, and give ourselves to that, open ourselves to that. And that opening is not a narrowing of who we are and our potencies. It is actually the release of ourselves from our own traps, which is what people like Krishnamurti talked about, that deconditioning is very important. And somebody told me this morning, how about Tao, do nothing, that passivity where the inner beauty and joy and innocence can manifest. Whereas that, look at society today, it is so competitive, it's based on anxiety, and so without consecration, where will you have, call it dedication, consecration is a very high word. Without that, where is the design? Where is the execution? There's only chaos, confusion.
Yes, go ahead.
Hindol, my question to you.
Sure.
What were Swamiji's politics like? I mean, politically, if you were to define him in today's terms,
Yeah.
would he be more right-leaning or left-leaning or center of right? I mean, is it possible to define him in those terms?
I think to begin with, Swamiji would take right, left, and center together, make it into a little football, and give it one tight kick to send it out. That's number one. Absolutely, ma'am. So that's number one. I think these labels, I think if there is one man who fought against labels all his life, it was Swami Vivekananda. That you could not encase him, you could not entrap him into one label and just stamp it on him. That's number one. Number two, however, having said that, he was a clear nationalist. I mean, Swami Vivekananda is one of those epic figures. So there are two things, I think, and I want to put this to this audience and to both of you. Two seminal ideas that we discuss every day in India, but we don't discuss enough about Swami Vivekananda in those ideas. One is liberalism. Swami Vivekananda is a great liberal, and we've just started that. I've just written this essay in the Center for Civil Society's book on liberalism. That's one. And the other, of course, a little more spoken about, the definition of the contours of Indian nationalism. Because I think Swamiji really sees that Indian nationalism, and which later on, much later, Diana Eck has written, comes from a deep spirituality and engagement with the land. It does not create an opposition with somebody else. And I think Vivekananda saw that. He realized that Indian nationalism doesn't have to be this, it doesn't have to constantly become a quarrel with somebody else. The civilization itself was deep and strong enough to give itself a nationalism which wasn't constantly at war. The perhaps apocryphal story, I'm sure both of you know this thing about Chicago where he goes and somebody says, oh look, the Bhagavad Gita is right at the end of this pile of books. And look, your book is right at the end. I mean, maybe it's an apocryphal story, I don't know, but it is mentioned often. And he says, well, because the Bhagavad Gita can take the load of all of it. Yeah, it's a good foundation. So it's an interesting thing. Yes.
I mean, continuing with what you were saying, I think this liberalism or this larger world view of Vivekananda is what, and the resistance to labels is what we have to finally take back with us. Even in the Chicago address, he had said that all religions were not merely to be tolerated, because tolerating a religion sounds condescending. He said we have to accept them, all religions, as true. You follow your own path, but all religions make sense, they have a reason, and let's accept them. I think that is very profound.
And and the fact that he was unafraid, like on one hand, he's giving speech after speech condemning conversions in India, Christian. But remember, this is the same man who also carries with him often the imitation of Christ. So this, he's unafraid to engage with ideas and give his perspective. What he likes, he adores and he champions. But what he doesn't like, not just about his own religion, but any other religion that he sees that he doesn't like, he's unafraid to say it. And I think one of the things that why I wrote the book called The Modern Monk is, I think Hinduism today, and I as a Hindu, somehow we have a very timid worldview. And I think Vivekananda is not timid. I think that is one of my key takeaways. He's not a timid person by any stretch of imagination.
Precisely. I would add that, in his first address in Chicago, he says, I want to sound from here the death knell of all fanaticism. So I think we have to remember that you can be fanatical left or right. And that's not what Vivekananda was. And the other side, as you said, is that when he said all religions let's accept, he also said Vedanta is the best. Now, some people have made him out to be a Hindu supremacist. There's a whole book on that, by Jyotirmay Sharma, for instance. And I don't agree because he has taken these quotations out of context. Because Vivekananda said Vedanta is the best when he was confronted with others who said that all of you will go to hell, for instance, So we have to contextualize his remarks. And there's a book on him saying Vivekananda the socialist, because he really wanted equality. He didn't like adhikara bheda. He didn't want ancestral rights. But this is also very important. He didn't want everybody to be degraded and leveled. He wanted everybody to be lifted up. He said, the Shudra revolution for him was not bringing everybody down, but raising everyone up. So, today we want to appropriate everyone to our own political positions. But I think it's important for us, each one of us is so unique. So regardless of our politics, we should never succumb to the temptation of reducing ourselves to any given party line, but keep ourselves open. Even if you have particular, affiliations, that's normal. But I think the real takeaway of Swamiji or practical Vedanta is to discover the immensity of what each one of us is and to manifest it. And in order to do that, I think it behooves us not to subordinate this creative energy in all of us to any one doctrine or ideology, which is so reductive and it is self-imprisoning. So let's free ourselves from the manacles of the mind, as it were, and open ourselves to the immensity that surrounds us and is within us.
One last point about how Vivekananda rejects labels. I was just in Kerala launching my book, and I noticed there these huge posters by the CPM, by the communists in Kerala, saying Vivekananda is this great socialist hero, and then, Lenin, and then Marx, and then clearly Vivekananda. Which is astonishing to me, right? And of course, as many BJP leaders really like Vivekananda, they champion him. In Calcutta, if the CPM really bowed to anybody finally, it was finally Vivekananda. And there were many shenanigans there. But I'm saying, he sort of, as I say in my book, from Nehru to Modi, there is no prime minister who hasn't doffed their cap, so to speak, to Vivekananda. So he's in that sense truly egalitarian. Anybody else? Yes, sir. You're in the microphone.
Since he is he was a very practical monk, do we get any insights as to whether he had read Chanakya or Arthashastra, and if he had any comments on that? Because Arthashastra is one of the most practical things or texts of ancient India.
Yes, he had read Chanakya, and he does quote him in his complete works. You can do a Google search and see. And a part of practical Vedanta is precisely that, to be successful in the world. In fact, there's a misapprehension about, Indian, spirituality, that it's all world negating. It's actually Shreyas and Akshitam. Shreyo Akshitam, that's the formula of the Vedas. That is success in this world and immortality in the hereafter. And I think it's that robust, this worldly engagement with every aspect of our lives, economic, political, social, that characterizes Vivekananda's modernity, And at the same time, if you neglect that inner dimension, then again your life is very incomplete. Bahut adhura hai. So it's an integrated worldview, and ultimately it's Purna Yoga, as it were. It's a way to integrate all these dimensions of our existence and make life beautiful and worth living and full of relish and shreya, not just shreyas, not just prayas.
Okay, we've completely run out of time. We are happy to engage with you outside this hall. We have to empty it because the next session has to begin. I think, concluding remark, if I may, Vivekananda finally told us not just to read the Bhagavad Gita, but perhaps we'll find God even if we play football. Now, if India gets to football and wins the Football World Cup, I would be very happy, and so would Vivekananda. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
We are doing well. We are doing very well in cricket, so
there's some hope. There's some hope. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you.
Let's give a big round of applause to all our speakers. Thank you so much. And we thank DNA.